Fuzzy Mud, Chapter 15, Down in the Dungeon. There was still no sign of Chad when Marshall walked into his classroom and took his seat. His relief quickly turned into anxiety, however. He turned his head toward the door every single time he heard it open. He knew Chad would come waltzing in at any moment, telling everyone about what had happened in the woods, and about how Marshall had needed a little fifth-grade girl to protect him. Even after class started and Chad still hadn't shown, Marshall's anxiety only grew worse. He tapped his foot throughout morning announcements. In a way, he hoped Chad would hurry up and get there. Let him do what he was going to do, say what he was going to say, and just get it over with. The worst part was the waiting. When first period ended, Marshall moved cautiously through the hall, certain that Chad was waiting behind every corner. He made it safely to algebra, and when he saw that Chad's desk was empty, he finally was able to relax, but just a little bit. Math had always been Marshall's best subject, and without Chad's eyes burning a hole through the back of his head, he was able to concentrate for the first time in weeks. Mr. Brandt put a pair of simultaneous equations on the whiteboard. Marshall mentally went through the necessary steps to solve them just as his teacher worked through them for the class. Mr. Brandt put up 2 more equations. Anyone want to try? Chad or no Chad, Marshall still didn't dare raise his hand. Perhaps Mr. Brandt had caught something in Marshall's expression, an alertness in his eyes. Marshall, he said, you want to give it a go? Marshall flinched at the mention of his name, then slowly rose. As he made his way to the front of the room, he heard none of the usual snide whispers. No legs stuck out trying to trip him. He took the marker from Mr. Brandt, studied the 2 equations for a moment, and then wrote a new equation, combining elements from the other 2. He felt his confidence grow as he replaced letters with numbers. Behind him, the door opened. It couldn't even have been called a squeak, just an old door rotating on its hinges. But Marshall recognized the sound the moment he heard it. His confidence left him as his legs turned to jelly. He tried to concentrate on the equations in front of him, but now it was all just a confused jumble of numbers, letters, and mathematical signs. He heard the click-click of hard shoes on the floor. That didn't sound like Chad. He slowly turned. The headmistress, Mrs. Thaxton, was walking purposefully toward the front of the room, a stern and determined look on her face. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Brandt, she said, then turned her back on Marshall in order to face the class. I'm afraid I have some very disturbing news. Marshall didn't know where he was supposed to go. He didn't want to have to cross in front of Mrs. Thaxton in order to return to his desk. Instead, he slowly edged away from the board, toward the side wall. He spoke slowly and deliberately. One of your classmates, Chad Hillegas, is missing. He hasn't been seen since he left school yesterday afternoon. As far as we know, he never made it home. Mrs. Thaxton took a breath, then continued, If any of you know anything about where he might have gone or what has happened to him, I need to know immediately. Nobody said a word. As Marshall stood at the side wall, his thoughts were a swirling mass of confusion. He had become paralyzed at the mention of Chad's name. He could hear the pounding of his heart echoing inside his head. Does anybody remember seeing Chad after school yesterday? Asked Mr. Brandt. If you saw or heard anything, coaxed Mrs. Thaxton. Marshall knew he ought to say something, but it seemed impossible. Laura Muskrantz slowly raised her hand. Yes, Laura, said Mr. Brandt. I saw him. Where? On Richmond Road. Did he say anything to you? Mrs. Thaxton asked her. No, I was in my mom's car. We just drove past. You asked if we saw him, that's all. Marshall wondered if Laura would have noticed him, too, if he had been there. Did you notice which way he was heading? Asked Mrs. Thaxton. If you leave the school and turn right, I think. We drove the other way, so I didn't see him after that. Did anyone else see or talk to Chad? Asked Mrs. Thaxton. Either after school or perhaps earlier? Did he say what his plans were for after school? Cody raised his hand, then quickly lowered it, but not before Mr. Brandt noticed. Do you know something, Cody? He kind of told me what he was going to do, but I feel weird saying it. What did he tell you, Cody? Demanded Mrs. Thaxton. This is not the time to worry about being embarrassed or feeling weird. Okay, you asked, Cody shrugged. He said he was going to beat up Marshall. Muffled laughter came from the back corner of the room, but one look from Mrs. Thaxton silenced whoever had laughed. Sorry, man, Cody said, looking at Marshall. That's what he said. For the first time, Mrs. Thaxton turned to notice Marshall, standing awkwardly against the wall. Marshall, what do you know about this? All he could manage was a shrug. It took all his effort just to keep from trembling. Did you encounter Chad on your way home yesterday? He shook his head. Did you know he was looking for you? No, he said. You didn't see him at all? I just walked home like always. He wasn't there. Mrs. Thaxton took a long, hard look at him. Do you know why he wanted to fight you? Did something happen earlier? He shook his head. Chad's been picking on Marshall all year, said Andy, for no reason. Marshall never did anything, volunteered Laura. Chad's just mean. Mrs. Thaxton took another long look at Marshall, then turned her attention back to the rest of the class. If anybody thinks of anything else, any little thing Chad might have done or said, or something somebody else might have said about Chad, please let Mr. Brandt or me know. If you need to talk in private, I will be in my office. Please think hard and don't be afraid to come to me. I will keep anything you tell me strictly confidential. She walked out of the room, then all eyes fixed on Marshall. He quickly returned to his seat. The equations remained on the whiteboard, unsolved.